About 2 decades ago, authorities in Palm Beach, Florida began receiving tips of a middle-aged, enigmatic billionaire abusing underage girls in the community. At that time, Jeffrey Epstein already carried an unusual reputation. People knew he was someone with deep ties to the upper echelon of society, though not much was known about the exact nature of those connections, where he acquired all his wealth, and what was happening inside the walls of his 14,000 square foot palace. That is until a concerned parent dialed 911 on March 14th, 2005, and expressed concern that her 14-year-old stepdaughter had received $300 in cash after a visit to a certain gentleman's house, as stated in the call that was later publicized in the Netflix documentary Filthy Rich. The girl, known only as Jane Doe 1 to police, had been bullied and was labeled a prostitute by other kids at Palm Beach Royal High after rumors of her and her friend giving Epstein a quote-unquote massage began circulating around the school, according to the Miami Herald journalist Julie K. Brown. As she wrote in her book, Perversion of Justice, an investigation would soon identify the cousin of Jane Doe's boyfriend, Haley Robson, as the 16-year-old who introduced her to the financier. Being one of his many teenage recruiters, Haley's job was to bring Epstein as many young victims as possible, telling People magazine that at 16, she had no idea what she was getting herself into, stating that she wasn't mature enough to understand the repercussions. Thinking to herself at the time, what am I gonna do next? Am I going to college? Am I gonna move? Am I gonna stay here? Etc. As she went on to testify that if a victim refused his sexual advances, they were sometimes made to bring him other girls. The younger, the better, as Haley recalled him saying. This created a years-long pyramid scheme of abuse, as some have called it, and finally prompted the Palm Beach PD to begin an investigation. Spying on Epstein's house and taking note of the young girls who would visit the man at all hours of the day, after digging through his trash and finding concerning receipts for sex books, police obtained a warrant and discovered a high school transcript belonging to one of his accusers, along with a receipt for a dozen roses that he sent the same girl. As Detective Joseph Ricari told Brown, the house was exactly how the girls had described it, right down to the bizarre color of the furniture. Although police identified over 24 victims during this time, we know for a fact there were still many, many more out there. In fact, one of the reasons we still don't know the precise number of girls Epstein abused is because of an infamous plea deal that would come later. A deal that essentially quashed an ongoing FBI investigation that could have exposed the scope of Epstein's operation right then and there, which is enough to leave any victim feeling despondent and disrespected. They could have seen justice if it weren't in part for Epstein's team of seasoned lawyers working with the government to hammer out a highly controversial agreement on the pedophile's terms.
One of the disappointed lawyers who pressed for release of the FBI Epstein dealings said the treatment went way beyond preferential.
Because they don't have to. There's no law or statute that says that the justification for a plea negotiation has to be actually written in there. It doesn't have to be written in there, and it really is something that we may never know, because it really is what came out of all of their negotiations.
What was so important to the government that sex crimes described in this agreement were treated so lightly?
Now, I would suggest you go ahead and watch part 1 of this series if you haven't already, as it sort of sets the groundwork for who Epstein was by 2005, the connections he had already made, and what victims had been saying about him from as early as 2002. This video will consist of everything that came after, as I'll try to explain to the best of my abilities how and why Epstein was allowed to continue abusing girls for nearly a decade after his short stint in prison.
The court docket with his name on it lists a string of delays and continuances, and that speaks to a deal in the works.
Now, if they can't make this go away, then they're going to minimize the damage. And that's what happened here. It's probably going to be damage control to have the shortest amount of prison time, the least amount of harm to him.
But before we go any further here, I do want to go ahead and thank today's sponsor, Aura. If you've ever Googled yourself, you may be alarmed to see a shocking amount of your own personal information, like your name or email address, exposed online for the entire world to see. Shady data brokers are known to sell your information to scammers, spammers, or to anyone else who may want to target you. Thankfully though, Aura shows you exactly which brokers are selling your information and can submit opt-out requests on your behalf. It helps reduce the amount of spam you get and protects you from hackers who may be trying to use that information to access your personal accounts. And it's all super easy to set up, which means you don't have to download several different apps to get features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more. Instead, you get it all at one convenient place at one affordable price. Just click the link in the description below or head to aura.com/jobry for a 14-day free trial and see how much of your information is already being sold right now. Huge thanks again to the amazing people over at Aura for sponsoring this one and keeping all of our data safe and secure.
Edward says he's fighting to have the federal plea deal for Epstein tossed out and a new prosecution launched. West Palm Beach Congresswoman Lois Frankel is calling for a congressional investigation.
When it comes to the Epstein plea deal, there's a small cast of characters we'll need to introduce. You had the Dersh, of course, but Epstein also brought on legal powerhouse Kenneth Starr to his all-star defense team. No pun intended there, I just realized how that sounds though. Starr, who rose to prominence when he uncovered the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal that led to the former president's impeachment, was also a member of the Federalist Society along with fellow Epstein attorney Jay Lefkowitz. The Federalist Society, as Brown points out in her book, is accredited with producing 6 Supreme Court justices, most notably Samuel Alito, who also just so happens to be Alexander Acosta's old mentor, a guy who, most famously, became known for personally approving the abhorrent plea deal, which adds to the idea that, as lead detective on the Epstein case, Joseph Reccari told Brown a lot of the prosecutors who should have been on the side of the victims found themselves weirdly enamored by those who made up Epstein's impressive defense team, adding the amount of evidence that disappeared or was covered up in this case was mind-boggling, referring to a horde of Epstein's computers and hard drives that mysteriously went missing upon a raid of his home. Not the last time this would happen, by the way. In fact, he and Michael Ryder, at the time the police chief who launched the original investigation into Epstein in Palm Beach, both maintained that for whatever reason, prosecutors would rather throw the case instead of go after someone so well connected in the political world. I mean, after all, maybe some of these guys wanted jobs in higher places. They weren't exactly gonna make any friends by throwing a prolific campaign donor behind bars for life. And one way of assuring Epstein would get a lighter sentence was by putting the case in front of a grand jury. A grand jury who, according to Reccari, was only given part of the Epstein story by state prosecutor Lana Belalovic. Belalovic, it should be mentioned, had her own doubts regarding the victims' testimonies, and basically fed right into the narrative Epstein's defense had tried cooking up, that these victims were actually not victims at all. They were drunks, delinquents, and drug users hell-bent on attacking an innocent old man for his money. They were nothing more than greedy prostitutes, according to both Epstein's defense and seemingly Belalovic herself. In her book, Brown recounts an alleged conversation between Reccari and Belalovic. Reccari asking the prosecutor, "How can you not believe these girls when you haven't even interviewed them?" Reccari himself had already interviewed at least 30 victims, by the way. Belalovic responded, "Look, we have pictures of a girl holding a beer in her hand. She's underage and she's drinking. They're talking about smoking pot and drinking and sex on MySpace. This is problematic." To which Reccari rightfully argued, "Tell me which teenager doesn't drink. Based on this criteria, you're telling me the only victim of sexual battery could be a nun." Reccari insisted the evidence they mounted against Epstein during this time, which included flight logs, phone records, phone numbers belonging to girls, copies of written phone messages found in Epstein's trash, and even a high school transcript belonging to one of the victims, was more than enough for a conviction. Not to mention at least 24 victims had been identified and interviewed by authorities at this point. For all intents and purposes, there was no valid reason for this not to be a slam dunk case, which makes what happened an even bigger travesty for all the girls traumatized at the hands of Epstein and his high-profile buddies. Once Dershowitz had officially taken the reins, Ryder described state attorney Barry Krischer's apparent heel turn to the New Yorker, noting also in a deposition that at first Krischer said, "Let's go for it. This is an adult male in his 50s who had sexual contact with children." But once Dershowitz got involved, the tone and tenor of the discussions of this case with Mr. Krischer changed completely. After meeting with Dershowitz a few times, who went to nasty lengths to destroy these girls' reputations, as he once supposedly told the attorney in private, Krischer made a controversial move to pull together a grand jury who did successfully charge Epstein in 2006 with only solicitation of a prostitute. Only that wasn't even really scratching the surface of what Epstein was being accused of. Not only had Epstein solicited sex from way more girls than just one, like the charge asserted, Ricari later told Brown he felt the grand jury hadn't been given the full picture of the situation at all, and that Belilovic and Krischer were essentially resting the entire case on one victim's testimony, not even alluding to the almost 30 other girls that had accused Epstein in total. These were also children, mind you. The fact that this child victim was reduced to just a prostitute in this ruling should be criminal in itself. It goes without saying that Michael Ryder was furious, as anyone with a conscience would be. I mean, Epstein was released on just a $3,000 bond hours after the charge. Those at the Palm Beach PD who knew the extent of Epstein's crimes immediately slammed Krischer for giving Epstein special treatment. Ryder then called upon the FBI to open their own investigation. During what was called Operation Leap Year, the FBI began to compile even more mountains of evidence against the financier. For a while, it looked like Epstein might finally be sent away for good, until Alan Dershowitz reached a shocking non-prosecution agreement with U.S. Attorney for Miami, Alexander Acosta. This secret deal that took over a year to negotiate has been rightfully and viciously criticized for giving Epstein basically all the leeway he could have asked for. Even Epstein's own attorneys called it unprecedented and highly unusual, just to give you a sense of how generous it was. Yes, it required him to plead guilty, but only to 2 state charges of procuring a minor for prostitution, which barely accounted for all the years worth of evidence and testimony Palm Beach authorities and now the FBI had collected. He was required to register as a sex offender, but that was a small fee for avoiding what could have been a lifetime in federal prison. Instead, Epstein was only required to spend 13 months in what was essentially just a summer camp for rich people at the end of the day. I mean, he was still allowed to go into his office during the day to complete work as long as he returned to his facility at night. Jail records show he would buy things like women's panties during this time and was seemingly allowed to go in and out of an unlocked cell at will thanks to his work release, reportedly spending 12 hours a day, 6 days a week at his private office. He was also apparently allowed to visit a chiropractor sometimes 3 days a week. Records even stopped referring to Epstein as an inmate eventually, just in case you were wondering how comfortable he was here. It got to a point where one U.S. attorney wrote to a deputy police chief that Epstein making telephone calls, web surfing, and having food delivered to him is probably not in accordance with the objectives of imprisonment. You think? And while we don't know everyone who visited Epstein behind bars, since most visitor logs were conveniently destroyed by authorities, he was visited by Jean-Luc Brunel upwards of 70 times in prison. I'm sure nothing shady was going on there. Attorneys representing Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2 called it one of the most extraordinarily lenient plea deals in modern history. To make it even more of a slap in the face, the only victim called to testify during this whole thing wasn't even told the deal had been struck, and neither had her lawyer, though that didn't stop Belilovic from telling the judge that the victim had in fact agreed to the deal as stated by Brown. And if you were wondering what happened to Alexander Acosta, well, let's just say he saw a little bit of a bump in status when he was appointed U.S. Secretary of Labor in 2017, handpicked by the 45th President, Donald J. Trump.
The nominee for Secretary of the Department of Labor will be Mr. Alex Acosta.
Brown acknowledges that as labor secretary, Acosta would have had direct oversight of America's labor laws, which quite literally includes human trafficking. In fact, if it weren't for her bombshell article published in 2018, it's likely Acosta would have kept that position longer, and it may have kept Epstein further away from public consciousness too. It was really the work of Julie K. Brown and others at the Miami Herald that demanded attention be brought to this dark stain on Acosta's resume and called for a re-examination of Epstein himself, which ultimately culminated with his second arrest the following year. Not even Congress seemed to give a second thought toward Acosta's sweetheart deal, as they confirmed him to the president's cabinet with ease. So if you needed to have any less faith in our government, there you go. Acosta, however, facing public pressure, chose to resign from the Trump administration in shame, about 2 years after he got the job. Then, after an extensive investigation into the Epstein deal in 2020, the Department of Justice ruled that while Alexander Acosta acted in, quote, poor judgment, his decision did not translate to professional misconduct, despite leaving the victims completely in the dark while plea negotiations were underway. And although Acosta may have personally maintained that he did nothing wrong, standing by his decision and offering no apologies to the victims, the scandal had already cost him his career. So not sure what he's up to now, but I'm just glad we don't have to see his face on TV anymore. By 2009, Epstein was a free man, even though he resented Dershowitz for getting him what he believed to be too harsh of a sentence. After all, Epstein never believed his crimes amounted to anything more than stealing a bagel, in his own words. To give you an idea of the ego we're dealing with here, once Epstein got out, he commissioned an entire mural of himself in prison as a reminder of where he had once been and where he could very well end up again. Not like this would stop him from abusing more women over the next decade, though. In December 2023, the Wall Street Journal published an extensive piece documenting in great detail all of the women who have since come forward about the experience they've had with Jeffrey Epstein after he got out of prison in 2009. And it should be emphasized, every single instance of abuse outlined in this article after 2009 would not have happened had Epstein been rightfully sent to jail for life when authorities had him. He was instead able to throw $100,000 at a well-known PR firm to rehabilitate his image in 2011, according to court documents. The same firm previously used by Michael Vick and Rush Limbaugh to varying degrees of success, I suppose. Either way, Epstein didn't seem to have much of a problem getting on the good side of scientists who gladly accepted hefty donations to their Ivy League schools and laboratories. One particular beneficiary, who was actually cool with Epstein on a personal level before and after his sentencing, was theoretical physicist at Arizona State and Yale, Lawrence Krauss. Krauss, who I mentioned at the beginning of this video, actually gave that Daily Beast article some more quotables, which are very rough. They're rough, okay? If anything, the unfortunate period he suffered has caused him to really think about what he wants to do with his money and his time, and support knowledge, which, by the way, again, is just such a laughable sentiment. What knowledge Jeffrey Epstein had to offer the scientific community beyond a blank check and occasional visits to Pedophile Island is truly beyond my speculation. He believed in cryogenics, for God's sake. He wanted his penis frozen so that he could keep having sex after he died. He wanted to ingratiate his DNA into the human collective at his baby-making farm in New Mexico. To think that this guy was some scientific expert? That's insane! That's just not true. That's insane. I'm sorry, that's insane. But Krauss doesn't stop there, only continuing to blow smoke up his ass by telling Alexandra Wolf, Jeffrey has surrounded himself with beautiful women and young women, but they're not as young as the ones that were claimed. So obviously that means the claims couldn't be true, right? Come on, Krauss. Use your purported scientific reasoning here to deduce that Epstein, a guy that now, by her own admission, hangs out with girls significantly younger than him, might just possibly go a tad lower than that too while he's at it. I mean, then again, I'm not the one with a PhD. So he continues, as a scientist, I always judge things on empirical evidence, and he always has women ages 19 to 23 around him, but I've never seen anything else. So as a scientist, my presumption is that whatever the problems were, I would believe him over other people. Capping it off with that amazing quote I referenced at the beginning. Just disturbing doesn't even begin to describe it. Though Krauss's closeness with Epstein maybe isn't as much of a shock in hindsight, now that there have been a slew of other allegations against Krauss in the years following his proud endorsement of Epstein here. But he has been pretty much excluded from all professional circles he used to occupy. Years too late, in my opinion. A 2019 BuzzFeed investigation discovered IRS forms proving that Epstein was also not just a regular contributor, but apparently the most generous contributor to the EDGE Foundation, a group of scientific intellectuals that included not just Krauss, but also Steven Pinker, a cognitive psychologist and linguist who claims to not really know Epstein, but still found himself in some hot water when it was revealed Dershowitz tapped him for help on interpreting a law in Epstein's Palm Beach case. One of the most notable intellectuals introduced Epstein through the EDGE Foundation was none other than Stephen Hawking, a name whose appearance in the latest batch of unsealed court documents shocked the world. As you probably know at this point, Hawking had a pretty ominous connection to the pedophile. If you didn't see it in the news, you probably saw it on TikTok or South Park pretty soon probably. But I will go ahead and let you know that right off the bat, this screenshot is not real. I know it may have looked real at first, considering the Photoshop or Inspect Element job someone did on it, but I gotta tell you, the actual mention of Hawking's name is somehow even more concerning. According to the recent drop, Epstein named the physicist in an extremely poorly worded email he typed to Ghislaine Maxwell, instructing her on how to reward any of Virginia's friends and family willing to disprove allegations that Hawking, quote, participated in an underage orgy on Little St. James. Now, we know that Hawking did in fact visit the island the same year this email was sent out, as evident by these photos taken in 2006, where Hawking can be seen attending a conference on gravity. Here he is trying out a submarine that Ghislaine specifically tailored for his wheelchair. I mean, what else are friends for, right? A newspaper article from that time even features a quote from Epstein where he seems to describe the purpose of that dinner. There is no agenda except fun and physics, and that's fun with a capital F. I mean, that's just such a weird statement when you consider who it's coming from. Wait, what do you mean by fun? The New York Times also provided a bit more context in 2019, noting that it took place over the course of 5 days and included this email from physicist Alan Guth, who told the Times that Epstein was always followed by a group of something like 3 or 4 young women, which lines up with what we've heard from Miles and Kathy Alexander, the couple who ran the island from 1999 to 2007. Kathy telling the Daily Mail in 2011 that she became concerned about the ages of the young girls he was bringing to the island. A few of them looked very young, and I couldn't help but wonder if their mothers knew where they were, with Miles stating he sometimes had to push back against Epstein's attempts to, quote, smuggle in female guests by boat without logging their names. One former air traffic controller even telling Vanity Fair on multiple occasions, I saw Epstein exit his helicopter, stand on the tarmac in full view of my tower, and board his private jet with children, female children. They were always wearing college sweatshirts. It seemed like camouflage. That's the best way to put it. Recently described as, quote, the perfect hideaway and haven for trafficking young women and underage girls for sexual servitude in a lawsuit filed by the US Virgin Islands, Epstein initially bought Little St. James from venture capitalist Arch Cummin for $7 million in 1998, though he was reportedly known to spend time at the island even in the years predating the official purchase. In addition to ripping up all the native vegetation in exchange for 40-foot palm trees, Epstein decorated his 75-acre personal kingdom with a massive sundial, outdoor massage rooms, incredibly weird statues, swimming pools, a helipad, a tennis court, and a number of small villas, with the most infamous, of course, being this blue and white temple, with huge painted doors capped off with a golden dome that apparently blew off during Hurricane Maria. It also used to have statues around and on top of it, depicting what looks to be bird-like creatures on the roof, with what some have suggested are Greek gods out in front. But to this day, it still has not been confirmed what this temple was officially used for, with some of the wilder conspiracy theories being it was anything from a place for Epstein to carry out sacrifices to a burial ground for his late parents. However, Business Insider's J.K. Trotter was able to track down a piano tutor by the name of Patrick Barron, who visited the temple twice in 2012 to tune a Wurlitzer grand piano belonging to Epstein. While he never met the man himself, Barron described Epstein's lair as one large room with bookshelves that stretched all the way up to the ceiling. According to Barron, above the black piano he was there to tune up hung a large portrait depicting Jeffrey Epstein next to Pope John Paul II, which, yes, was confirmed to actually exist during Ghislaine's 2021 trial. Footage taken by urban explorers over the last couple of years also seemed to back up Barron's claim, since there really doesn't seem to be much of anything inside this one room, which fuels another conspiracy that Epstein installed an intricate tunnel system that sprawled beneath the island, with some wondering if these bunkers were there for anything more than just maintenance. But what we know about the island already is weird and grotesque enough on its own, as it was primarily a way for Epstein to abuse girls while distancing himself further from the feds. Or in Epstein's own words, this island was a place for him to truly do anything he wanted.
I realize what I am. I'm very comfortable in my own skin, on my own island, or on my own ranch. I can think the thoughts I want to think. I can do the work I want to do, and I'm free to explore as I see fit.
But he sure didn't do it alone, as one recent lawsuit alleged. See, in 2022, the Virgin Islands filed a massive lawsuit against America's largest bank, JP Morgan, for knowingly, negligently, and unlawfully providing and pulling the levers through which recruiters and victims were paid and was indispensable to the operation and concealment of the Epstein trafficking enterprise. The suit also added that human trafficking was the principal business of the accounts Epstein maintained at JP Morgan. It alleged that the bank continued providing services for Epstein even after he was raising red flags for his conviction as a child sex offender in 2008, as he was one of their most valuable clients. Though a spokesperson for the bank has tried to say they would not have done business with Epstein if we believed he was using our bank in any way to help commit heinous crimes, a lawyer representing Epstein's victims argued in a June 2023 court filing that the bank had no reason not to know the extent of Epstein's profound relationship with the former head of JP Morgan's wealth management department, Jess Staley. Jess Staley's argument that he had no relationship with Jeffrey Epstein pretty much completely fell apart after a series of emails came out, depicting an extremely embarrassing bromance that included Jess writing to Epstein things like, "I miss you, the world is a tough place, hang in there," while he was jailed in Palm Beach for, again, being a pedophile. Epstein was assuring the executive he was free to use the island as much as he wanted while he was away. All the while, other JP Morgan executives were debating amongst themselves whether or not they should drop Epstein as a client. One 2008 email obtained by Bloomberg alluded to the bank being uncomfortable with Epstein, yet that didn't stop them from continuing to provide service to him until 2013, notably thanks to intervention from Staley himself. One 2010 email from JP Morgan's risk management literally asked the question, "See below, new allegations of an investigation related to child trafficking. Are you still comfortable with this client who is now a registered sex offender?" Rest assured though that as the Financial Times reported, the bank later confirmed that, quote, Jess Staley discussed the topic with Jeffrey Epstein, who replied there was no truth to the allegations, no evidence, and was not expecting any problems. Now is also a good time to mention that while the current JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon denies having ever heard of Epstein remarkably, further emails seem to show Leslie Groff, Epstein's personal assistant, setting up an in-person meeting between Epstein, Staley, and Dimon. Reading it, "Shall I have Lynn provide heavy snacks for your evening appointments with Jess Staley and Jamie Dimon? Or is this to be a nice sit-down dinner at 9 p.m? To which Epstein responded, "Snacks." The Financial Times also notes that Staley continued exchanging emails with Epstein reading, "So when all hell breaks loose and the world is crumbling, I will come here to Little St. James and be at peace. Presently, I'm in the hot tub with a glass of white wine. This is an amazing place, truly amazing. Next time, we're here together. I owe you much, and I deeply appreciate our friendship. I have few so profound." When Epstein sent a photo of a young woman, Staley then replied, "Don't tell me a French wine," to which Epstein remarked, "Always thoughts of alcohol." Whether that's code for something else is up to you to determine, of course. But separate emails also depict Staley referring to Disney princesses, writing, "That was fun. Say hi to Snow White for me." Epstein then asked, "What character would you like next?" When Staley answered Beauty and the Beast, Epstein stated, "Well, one side is available." And in 2008, while the two were making plans for Staley to visit Epstein's Palm Beach home, court filings allege Epstein wired a girl with an Eastern European surname $2,000, sending her another $3,000 in 2009, at the same time Staley told Epstein that he was going to London.
News was breaking overnight. Barclays CEO Jess Staley is stepping down, this following an investigation into his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
It should come as no surprise that the bank reached a settlement with the Virgin Islands for $75 million, along with another settlement for Epstein's victims, reportedly paying $290 million to over 100 girls abused by Epstein. Which is of course in addition to another $75 million settlement reached with Deutsche Bank, the biggest bank in Germany that, along with allegedly facilitating Epstein's trafficking ring from 2013 to 2018, has been embroiled in controversy throughout history, most notably when it financed last Auschwitz in World War II. Though neither settlement required Deutsche or JP Morgan to formally admit to any wrongdoing, these hefty payments do indicate to me just how willing they were to make the story disappear as fast as possible. After all, JP Morgan settled just days after former CEO Jamie Dimon and his successor Mary Erdos were called back to court to be re-deposed. I think it's clear these banks had more than a vested interest to keep their ties to Epstein as quiet as possible.
There have been some headlines recently regarding Jeffrey Epstein and the ongoing litigation there. Has it impacted your brand equity at all?
A little bit sometimes, but we banked Jeffrey Epstein, and I'm so sorry that we did. I wish we hadn't. Had we known then, we know today, we obviously wouldn't have. And so...
Have you changed the vetting of potential clients?
Yes. One of the more extraordinary revelations from the JP Morgan suit, though, is that we actually get to see more of Epstein's personal schedules, which identifies some of the people Epstein would meet with on a day-to-day basis, after he was a registered sex offender, of course. These names consisted of Woody Allen, Noam Chomsky, Bard College president Leon Botstein, and even former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who first met Epstein in 2003 and went on to visit him in both New York and Florida at least 30 times between 2013 and 2017. The Times of Israel has also pointed out that this included monthly meetings the pair had throughout 2015, while Epstein was having to regularly meet with attorneys representing his many victims. The fact this guy was able to just continue dining with literal world leaders, while at the same time popping in for a meeting with lawyers regarding numerous ongoing lawsuits, is just insane to me, with Chomsky even trying to say that Epstein's prison time indicated a quote clean slate. Magician David Copperfield was also known to visit Epstein after his time in prison, according to Epstein's personal schedules and a victim by the name of Johanna Schoberg, who testified that Copperfield once pulled her to the side and asked if she knew that girls were getting paid to find other girls. Out of all the powerful people Epstein mingled with during the last decade of his life specifically, when he was a known child sex offender, I should emphasize once again, there are some who have managed to at least keep their stories straight. Bill Gates is not one of those people.
You had a number of meetings with Jeffrey Epstein, who, when you met him 10 years ago, he was convicted of soliciting prostitution from minors.
When everything about Epstein blew up in 2019, Gates made sure to answer questions about his alleged contact with the predator as swiftly and as plainly as he could, admitting to the Wall Street Journal in an interview where he was doing promo for a Netflix documentary about himself, "I met him, I didn't have any business relationship or friendship with him, I didn't go to New Mexico or Florida or Palm Beach or any of that, except this wasn't true," okay? Shortly after he issued the statement, flight logs surfaced that showed Gates had in fact been to Florida. He just didn't know it, but I guess it isn't that uncommon to trip and fall onto a pedophile's private jet when you're that rich. Maybe that's why he ended up traveling to New York for a long late-night discussion at Epstein's townhome. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't yet made the little oopsie-doopsie of chatting late into the night with a publicly known child sex offender at his own house, but who am I to speak for others? All he said at the time in emails obtained by the New York Times were, Epstein's lifestyle is very different and kind of intriguing, although it would not work for me. Of course, he was only talking about the mansion's decor, according to one Gates spokesperson, but may I remind you that his New York mansion contained a mural of himself in prison. I wonder if that part of Epstein's past came up at all during the conversation. We know Epstein himself thought everything went great, though, writing in his own email reviewed by the Times simply, "Bill's great." They would go on to meet a couple more times in 2011, first at a TED Talk in California, before again at Epstein's townhome a second time, when this photo was taken showing the two men standing next to Jess Staley, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, and Gates Foundation advisor Boris Nikolic. And as of late October 2014, Bill Gates made a $2 million donation to MIT's Media Lab, which has since been exposed for having direct ties to Epstein. And sure, maybe you could say that, oh well, he just didn't know that and he wanted to help out the Media Lab. And maybe, but in an email obtained by the New Yorker, lab director Joy Ito made sure to clarify in the donation, hey, this is a $2 million gift from Bill Gates directed by Jeffrey Epstein. In response, another Gates spokesperson retaliated with any claim that Epstein Epstein directed any programmatic or personal grant making for Bill Gates is completely false. But it's worth noting that these meetings are what actually contributed to the Gates' 2021 divorce, which is actually something I did not know before setting out to make this video. Apparently, Bill Gates' ex-wife Melinda told CBS, "I did not like that he had meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. No, I made that clear to him." And while it's true that she had also accompanied her husband on one of these visits to Epstein's place, she told CBS it was to see who this man was, and that she regretted it the second I walked in the door. He was abhorrent. He was evil personified, adding that she later had nightmares about the man. The Daily Beast also reported that this meeting was completely unknown to the public until Melinda spoke out, with one source close to the Gates family also confirming to the outlet she was furious at the relationship, which begs the question if she knew how evil Epstein was and made it clear to her husband just why she didn't like them hanging out together, then why didn't Bill Gates cease all communication? I mean, as Vice notes, we know they met around 6 times between 2011 and 2013, then dozens of times in 2014. That would have given him plenty of time to figure out what Epstein had been convicted of. It makes no sense to keep going to these meetings. How can you turn around and say you regret your association with the man now that it's convenient when your own ex-wife tried to warn you years earlier? But it does make it a bit harder for him to repeat the tired defense that he had no relationship, personal or business, with the man. He basically says one thing, only to have the media dig deeper and learn that actually it was a much different story than what he had originally claimed. It's annoying because if you're truly innocent, then just lay it all out there so people don't have to speculate. Whether or not we'll ever truly know the exact picture of their relationship remains to be seen.
Is there a lesson for you, for anyone else looking at this?
Well, he's dead, so.
Alright, we've covered a lot of ground so far. Now we can finally explore the debated question, did Jeffrey Epstein kill himself? Except, in order to answer that, we may need to understand how Jeffrey Epstein was ever put in a position to kill himself in the first place. See, the Department of Justice, under Attorney General William Barr, who, if you remember, is the son of the guy who gave Epstein his first job at the Dalton School decades earlier, actually began looking into that notorious plea deal cut by Acosta in early 2019, only a few months after the Miami Herald expose went live, which all culminated with people asking some pretty simple questions like, okay, even though Acosta went easy on a child sex offender 12 years ago, can that same child sex offender still be arrested on federal charges, assuming the scope of his crimes extended outside the Miami area? Well, turns out the answer was yes. After returning from a trip to Paris, Epstein would fly into Teterboro Airport in New Jersey on the evening of July 6, 2019, where he was swarmed by federal agents and arrested under suspicion of sex trafficking minors. While this was happening, the FBI, who had just obtained a search warrant for Epstein's Manhattan residence, forced their way past the daunting 15-foot tall front doors in search of any incriminating evidence inside its walls. As we know from Ghislaine's subsequent trial, feds located and photographed a swath of material stuffed inside bags and drawers throughout the home's 40 rooms, including $70,000 in cash, nearly 50 diamonds, that fake passport I mentioned a while ago, and perhaps most notably, hard drives and CDs recovered from a safe that investigators had sawn into. Court documents confirmed these CDs came with handwritten labels reading things like young name plus name on them. But here's where our story becomes uniquely frustrating. Kelly McGuire, an FBI special agent working for the Bureau's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force, testified in 2019 that although they had acquired a warrant to enter Epstein's home, she and her team did not yet have a warrant to take any items with them. But you'd think it would pose somewhat of a liability to just leave all that evidence sitting in that house overnight. Someone with authority to enter the residence could come in and just take it, right? No, but that would never happen here. I mean, it's a federal case. The FBI can be trusted. trusted to go back and secure those materials, right? I think you can tell by the sarcasm in my voice that they, in fact, did not really do that. As Agent McGuire went on to testify under oath that the contents of the safe were suddenly missing by the time the FBI returned 4 days later on July 11th with a new warrant. It seemed like someone in the Epstein camp had already stopped by the mansion and confiscated the items the FBI intended to submit as evidence. So naturally, McGuire called up Epstein's lawyer and now executor for the Epstein estate, Richard Kahn, and basically asked him, hey, where the fuck are the tapes that were here? To which Kahn said, don't worry, I imagine. We've got everything you're looking for, and we're on our way. You can trust us. I'm just speculating here. I think that's what he said. Within minutes of her call, as McGuire testified, Kahn appeared at the townhome with 2 suitcases full of the missing evidence. The problem with that, though, as the Telegraph notes, is that McGuire could not confirm if the content on those CDs was the same as before. The Telegraph also notes here, another part of McGuire's testimony, that some of the hard drives had already been labeled as evidence by the time the FBI found it, and that she didn't know why that was or who could have labeled it because it wasn't them. But if you remember from earlier, Epstein's Palm Beach residence saw computers and hard drives hastily removed before officers could enter his home. Back then, as Joe Ricari told Julie K. Brown. Whether or not these were the same hard drives is unclear, but the fact remained that Epstein seemed to keep meticulous records of everyone coming in and out of his many properties. We know this thanks to a few different sources, one of which being Maria Farmer, who had been to Epstein's Manhattan townhome and told CBS the main thing he did when I walked in, and I thought was interesting, he showed me where the cameras, the men monitoring everything, were. So if you're facing the house, there's a window on the right that's barred. That's the media room, is what he called it. And so there was a door that looked like an invisible door with all this limestone and everything, and you push it and you go in. And I saw all the cameras. It was like old televisions basically, like stacked. They were monitors inside this cabinet, and there were men sitting here, and I looked on the cameras and I saw toilet, bed, toilet, bed. I'm like, I am never gonna use the restroom here, and I'm never gonna sleep here. You know what I mean? It was very obvious that they were like monitoring private moments. But that wasn't the only place Epstein is said to have had cameras. As Brown noted in her book, that upon arriving to the Virgin Islands to scope the place out for herself, she spoke with a couple off the record who each claimed to be employed by Epstein. They alleged that Epstein's other employee, Leslie Groff, flew in from New York and began dismantling the camera system from the island the day Epstein was arrested on July 6, mentioning that a steel safe had been carted away as well. And by the time the FBI arrived and ordered the employees to leave the island, the cameras and safe that had been there were already long gone. Groff, of course, had denied all of this to Brown, but it is something to consider, especially when you pair it with the claims made by Sarah Ransom, another Epstein victim who alluded to journalists in 2016 that Epstein kept sex tapes of Clinton, Prince Andrew, and billionaire Richard Branson for blackmail, all of whom deny this unequivocally. Before long, Ransom would publicly retract this claim, insisting that she had actually made up the tapes in an effort to bring more attention to the Epstein case as a whole. And that's about where things remained until this year, when Ransom retracted her retraction, recently telling Good Morning Britain there are videos that exist and the people know they exist. I'm sure they are very frightened of them being released. It's no secret that everything was recorded. Multiple victims have come forward confirming my account, along with others. I've seen recordings in Epstein's office. The reason for coming forward, she says, was Ghislaine Maxwell's imprisonment, as before she felt threatened by the sex trafficker to retract her claim.
All the individuals you've named have denied these claims. Why did you backtrack on the allegations?
In the time that I was with Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, amongst others, regularly enforced that if I ever did come forward, myself and my family would be harmed.
I don't think I need to say at this point that it would not be out of character for Epstein to threaten people. He's done it to countless victims over the years, and he also has a track record of doing it with journalists. So would it be outside of the realm of possibility for him to keep sensitive material on powerful clients on deck that he could use as leverage against them? He already tried it once. According to a report from the Wall Street Journal, which acknowledged a time the late Predator came into contact with one of Bill Gates' mistresses in 2017, according According to the Journal, Epstein reached out to Gates via email in a threatening tone, almost as if to let him know he had something on the Microsoft founder, and that he better comply to his financial demands or else. Knowing this, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume there was some kind of blackmail operation going on, at least in some capacity. Whether he was doing this for his own personal interest or at the behest of a much larger entity, as some have alleged, which is another hotly debated theory that we'll explore more in part 3. But I'll leave this segment with a reported quote from Alexander Acosta. In 2019, Vicky Ward wrote in the Daily Beast of a conversation she had with an anonymous senior White House official. Not knowing her previous experience writing about Epstein, this official let Ward in on some of Acosta's reasoning for cutting the plea deal all those years ago. According to him, Acosta defended himself behind closed doors, stating, "I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone." Acosta opted not to comment when asked about his alleged meeting. Okay, so I promise we're going to talk about Epstein's death now, okay? I know I said that a little while ago, but I couldn't not bring up the blackmail stuff. I mean, it had to fit in somewhere. The bottom line is now we know when, where, and why he was arrested again after a decade of roaming free. The question becomes, what happened during the 36 days Epstein remained incarcerated in the same federal prison known for keeping El Chapo, Bernie Madoff, World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef, mob boss John Gotti, and even an Osama bin Laden associate alive within its walls? Let's finally get into it. A review by the Department of Justice states that Jeffrey Epstein, now reduced to inmate 763-18054, was assigned to a cell in the Special Housing Unit of the now temporarily shut down Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York on July 7th, where he would be locked away in his cell from other inmates for 23 hours out of the day. On July 9th, he was screened on a formal suicide assessment by psychological staff who determined that Epstein did not meet criteria for a psychological diagnosis. He himself denied any suicidal ideation. On the early morning of July 23rd, however, the report notes that correctional officers responded to Epstein's cell, where he was found with an orange cloth wrapped around his neck, and what medical personnel declared was an attempted suicide. Epstein was alive, but he would be placed under suicide watch, where he remained for only 1 day, though he did stay under psychological evaluation for the rest of that week. Epstein himself told police that a cellmate had tried to kill him before later admitting he didn't know what happened to him and didn't want to talk about it further. Although it would appear 2 fellow cellmates corroborated that Epstein tried to hang himself from his bunk bed ladder, though no disciplinary charges were brought against Epstein due to what the DOJ called insufficient evidence of self-mutilation. He would then be assigned a new cellmate until August 8th, when arrangements were made to transfer him elsewhere. Only no new arrangements were made to assign Epstein another cellmate. That same day, without the prison's knowledge, Epstein met with attorneys to sign his last will and testament. On August 9th, over 2,000 pages from a suit against Ghislaine Maxwell were unsealed by a U.S. Court of Appeals, giving the public even more insight into Epstein and Ghislaine's criminal activity. That day, Epstein was authorized to make an unrecorded and unmonitored telephone call with, as he told prison staff, his mother. What staff didn't know was that Epstein's mother had been dead for 15 years. During the night of August 9th, no one stopped by to check in on Epstein, who was now spending the night alone without a cellmate. The DOJ notes that prison round sheets were then falsified to show staff had been doing regular 30-minute checks on Epstein, when in reality, they hadn't. On the morning of August 10th, at approximately 6:30 a.m., material handler Michael Thomas attempted to deliver Epstein his breakfast. When Epstein didn't respond to verbal commands, Thomas opened the cell door to find Epstein hanging from his bed in a sitting position, dangling 1 inch off the ground. The report notes he had used excess clothing from what would have belonged to his cellmate to create a noose. Thomas ripped the noose from Epstein's neck, causing his body to drop to the ground, where he began chest compressions. But at that point, it was far too late. Epstein was shuttled in an ambulance by EMTs and rushed to New York Presbyterian Hospital, where he was officially pronounced dead at 7:36 a.m.
The raid today, our cameras there at Jeffrey Epstein's private island, and it all comes, of course, as outrage grows tonight. Why wasn't anyone watching Epstein in jail? How was he allowed to take his own life? Attorney General William Barr saying he is, quote, appalled that this happened at a federal jail.
I think everyone knows where they were when they first heard about Jeffrey Epstein's death. I remember being at a college orientation when I looked down at my phone and saw the news. Naturally, I did what any level-headed person would do in that moment and ran to Twitter, where I pretty much saw everyone on my timeline giving their own theories of what truly happened. If you remember, Trump actually took the opportunity to immediately blame the Clintons, which, as much as I can't stand the guy, is a pretty good move, I can't lie. But whatever the case, you have to concede the circumstances here were a little off. Here was this guy at the center of one of the highest profile cases in recent memory who somehow managed to kill himself in federal prison just days after getting off suicide watch. So why was he taken off suicide watch? Why wasn't he given another cellmate? Why were there no photos of Epstein's body as they found it? Why were the cameras pointed at his cell broken? And why were the guards assigned to watch him literally asleep on the job at the time of his death? In fact, we now know that video evidence proved these guards were also on their computers, playing games and shopping online when they should have been making 30-minute checks on the inmates. Attorney General Barr called it a perfect storm of screw-ups, which is certainly one way to put it, I guess. A New York medical examiner by the name of Barbara Sampson performed an autopsy on Epstein's body and ruled his death a suicide before an investigation could even be concluded. A private pathologist by the name of Michael Baden, on the other hand, who had been present during the Epstein autopsy, came away with a completely different theory, that Epstein couldn't have killed himself partly due to a broken hyoid bone in his neck that he claimed was far more consistent with strangulation inflicted by another person rather than hanging. However, this has been contested as well. CNN's Sanjay Gupta, for one, insisted that Epstein's old age caused his bones to weaken. Therefore, a broken hyoid alone would not have been indicative of murder. While standing by her initial ruling, Sampson herself has stated a broken hyoid could happen in both murders and suicides. This wasn't Baden's only evidence, though. He brought up how the bed Epstein supposedly hung himself from was too low to support his height, and also pointed to the ligature wound being in the middle of Epstein's neck, which Baden says isn't consistent with a in which the ligature would have been at the bottom of his jaw. A 60 Minutes investigation provided photos depicting a row of medicine bottles placed alongside the top bunk of Epstein's bed that were still somehow standing upright, which wouldn't exactly make sense if someone of Epstein's stature had just jolted themselves off the bed, with Baden also wondering why Epstein wouldn't just use the hose from his sleep apnea machine to do it. The he supposedly used was also notably not covered in blood, while his neck was. Another thing Baden pointed out. To this day, too many things still just don't make sense to me. But even if you don't believe Epstein was formally assassinated by members of the British Royal Guard or whatever inside his cell, it's possible he was instead given easier circumstances in which to kill himself. After all, he was put in the general population, the least restrictive area of the jail, as soon as he was arrested, shortly after being submitted into their system as a black man who had no prior convictions as a sex offender. Which, if you know even a little bit about Epstein's history and have eyes, you'll know is not true. It's pretty clear to me the people in charge, whether it be the US Marshals who arrested Epstein or the employees at the Metropolitan Correctional Facility, were all shockingly incompetent considering the high stakes they were facing. But the question I still have is whether or not that incompetence was willful. Like, how do you accidentally log one of the highest profile suspects of the decade as a completely different guy, basically? You're taking him off watch barely one day after you say he attempted to kill himself, and also you're letting him make unrecorded, unmonitored phone calls? How does all of this happen to the most important to keep alive inmate in the entire facility? Some will argue the lack of basic precaution is what allowed Epstein the opportunity to kill himself. But if that's how little oversight there was, then why completely rule out the idea that someone could also have entered his cell and just taken him out? After all, Epstein repeatedly told psychologists he was not suicidal, even being recorded at one point as saying went against his religion as a Jewish person, and that he was too afraid of the pain to go through with it. Even saying at one point, being alive is fun. With all the dirt he must have known, I just personally find it hard to believe he would have gone out on his own terms without at least first ratting on the people he was thought to be blackmailing all along anyway. This is an idea Mark Epstein seemed to echo as well, telling Julie K. Brown that he could understand if his brother killed himself after his sentencing, but the fact that he still had yet to even defend himself properly in court creates more than enough room for speculation. As asserted by Brown, Epstein wasn't known as someone who went down without a fight. He was still hiring new lawyers and coming up with ideas to get away with his crimes as he had once done before in Palm Beach. Whether or not Epstein would throw in the towel this early on without giving it a proper shot may, for the unforeseeable future at least, remain up in the air for anyone to determine for themselves.
Do you think Epstein killed himself sincerely?
I would say that he did, but there are those people, there are many people, I think you're one of them, right? But a lot of people think that he was killed. He knew a lot on a lot of people.
He was killed.
Whatever it is you personally believe, I think we can all agree that many powerful people must have breathed a sigh of relief after seeing that news, as all of the things Epstein alluded to knowing tragically died along with the man. Something that will always infuriate me about this case is that while Epstein and his girlfriend are commonly referred to as prolific traffickers, the question doesn't get asked enough: who were they trafficking to? We have an idea of some of the potential parties, thanks to what victims have alleged so far, but to this day, there is still only one person actually in jail for their connection to Epstein's operation. Her name is Ghislaine Maxwell.
The high seas make up 47% of our planet, but they are the least explored and least governed part of it. A British businesswoman now is hoping to change the status quo by turning the oceans into an online country known as Terramar. Now here it is. It's a website where you can sign up and become a citizen, stick your name on a parcel of ocean, or become an ambassador for one of the many marine species. I caught up with founder Ghislaine Maxwell to find out a little more about how this whole project works.
Well, that's pretty much going to do it for part 2. Believe it or not, there's still a lot more to talk about, but I'm going to reserve that for the next and final installment of this series, where we'll finally be delving into the woman behind Epstein's powerful connections, her background as a member of the prestigious Maxwell dynasty, and of course, those murky ties to international intelligence. That's going to do it for now, but follow me on Twitter, read this book, please, and keep in mind, Epstein didn't kill himself.